The next session is themed Regulations for the Evolving Green Grid of the 21st Century. And this session, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be chaired by Shabihul Hasnain Shastri, the Chairman, Delhi Electricity Regulatory Commission and former judge of Allahabad High Court. And of course, moderated by Shri Rahul Tongia, Senior Fellow, CSEP. So let me take the privilege of introducing our chair, our moderator, and all our esteemed speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first introduce Justice Shabihul Hasnain Shastri, retired from the Allahabad High Court and joined the office of Delhi Electricity Regulatory Commission as its chairperson on 22nd July 2021. Now, with his ancestral home in Allahabad, Justice Hasnain's educational journey happened across the state of Uttar Pradesh due to his father's transferable post as an electrical engineer with the Uttar Pradesh Rajya Vidyut Parishad. And during his illustrious career as a lawyer, Justice Hasnain represented the Union of India and the state of Uttar Pradesh as standing counsel for over a decade each. He was also a counsel for Uttar Pradesh Power Corporation Limited, Uttar Pradesh Mandi Parishad, Lucknow Development Authority, and UP DESCO, among others. A very warm welcome to Justice Shabihul Hasnain Shastri. Warm welcome, sir. We have with us our moderator, Dr. Rahul Tongia, who is Senior Fellow with CSEP in New Delhi. And there his work focuses on technology, and policy, and UP DESCO, among others. I would request the speakers to keep their microphones on mute while I just introduce all our speakers. So Dr. Rahul Tongia, as I was saying, is a Senior Fellow with CSEP in New Delhi, where his work focuses on technology and policy, especially for sustainable development. And he leads the Energy, Natural Resources and Sustainability Group at CSEP and is also active in broader issues of technology. His work spans the entire energy and electricity with focuses on supply options, including renewable energy, covering finance, grid integration, smart grids, which use innovative information and communications technology to improve management of the electric utility grid. Now let me welcome Dr. Tongia and also go on to inviting our speakers. I'm going to be introducing our speakers, ladies and gentlemen. We have with us Shri R.P. Singh, Chairman, Uttar Pradesh Electricity Regulatory Commission, who took charge as the chairman of UPRC on 2nd July 2018. Shri Raj Pratap Singh joined Indian Administrative Service in 1983 August from Uttar Pradesh cadre. He has dealt with policy formulation, budgeting, implementation, monitoring and coordination, personnel management and service delivery aspects of public administration. Also, additionally, he's worked as senior advisor for 3 years in a multilateral development institution, World Bank, at the board level at Washington, D.C. Warm welcome, sir. Let me now introduce Shri Neil Chatterjee, former chairman, Federal Regulatory Commission, USA, and he was nominated to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission by President Donald Trump in May 2017 and confirmed by the US Senate in August 2017. And over the years, Chairman Chatterjee has played an integral role in the passage of major energy, highway, and agriculture legislation. And prior to serving Leader McConnell, Chairman Chatterjee worked as a principal in government relations for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association and as an aide to House Republican Conference Chairwoman Deborah Price. Warm welcome to you, sir. Let me now introduce Shri B.N. Sharma, Chairman, Rajasthan Electricity Regulatory Commission. And during his career, ladies and gentlemen, he has handled assignments in various departments, ministries in Rajasthan, as well as central government, such as power, revenue, and finance. He was Chairman, National Anti-Profiteering Authority, Government of India, before his superannuation in 2019 and continued serving National Anti-Profiteering Authority, Government of India up to May 2021. And he also joined the Indian Administrative Service, the Premier Civil Services of India in 1985 in the Rajasthan cadre. Welcome, sir. We have with us Mr. Keisuke Sadamori, Energy Markets and Security Director, International Energy Agency, and he became the IEA Director for Energy Markets and Security in 2012. Leading an administrative structure that includes several core functions of the IEA, including monitoring global oil markets and responding to energy supply disruptions. And prior to joining the IEA, Mr. Sadamori, a Japanese national, held many senior positions at the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, including Deputy Director General at the Minister's Secretariat. Warm welcome, sir. I'd like to now introduce, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jean-Michel Glauchon, Director, Florence School of Regulation, he, ladies and gentlemen, has been advisor of DG Trend, DG Comp, and DG Research at the European Commission and of the French Energy Regulatory Commission, has been a coordinator and scientific advisor of several European research projects, and he's a search partner in the CEEPR at MIT, USA, and the EPRG at Cambridge University. He's been the first editor-in-chief of EEP, which is Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy. Warm welcome once again. Professor Glauchon was also part of the inaugural Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Shri Ganesh Srinivasan, the Chief Executive Officer of Tata Power DDL. The company is a public-private partnership and joint venture between Tata Power and the Government of National Capital Territory of Delhi, supplying electricity to a populace of over 7 million in North Delhi. And Shri Srinivasan brings with him 2 decades of experience in areas like power utility, infrastructure, cement, steel, automotive, product development and manufacturing, and spearheads strategy, operations transformation, and organizational development. In his preceding roles, he's been spearheading that. In his previous stint, he was also Chief Transmission and Distribution, Tata Power Mumbai. Also served as Head Strategy and Corporate Planning Division. Warm welcome, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now introduce to you Sri Rajat Sarawat, Executive Director, Economic Regulation Authority, Western Australia. He's an experienced energy sector professional and regulator, bringing 25 plus years of experience predominantly in development and implementation of regulatory framework in Australia's electricity and gas industry. And in addition to a consulting role with the Lantau Group on matters outside of Australia, he's responsible for managing Western Australia's economic regulatory authority functions under the wholesale electricity market and gas services information rules and performing other energy market related functions. Warm welcome, sir. With that, let me now introduce to you, ladies and gentlemen, Shri R.N. Sen, former chairman, West Bengal Electricity Regulatory Commission, and WBERC is a and ladies and gentlemen, Shri Sen is actually a power industry expert and has worked with some of the sector's biggest PSUs, including the Damodar Valley Corporation and NTPC Limited. And in the past, Mr. Sen has also held the position of chairman, DEC-MCL, a joint venture of a coal mining company, CEO of NTPC SAIL, and managing director, NTPC Alstom, and executive director, NTPC, among others. Warm welcome, sir. We have with us Mr. Harry Dole, Director General, the Independent Power Producers Association of India, and he has over 25 years of experience in the power and infrastructure sectors. The transition of the sectors, especially power, oil, and gas, from being entirely state controlled to the current stage of increasing private sector participation, led Mr. Dole to envisage the requirement for a neutral forum of discussion and examination of policy and regulatory issues for the development and private sector participation in the infrastructure sectors. And thus, in 1994, IPPAI, the Independent Power Producers Association of India, was formed as an independent not-for-profit organization. So a very warm welcome to the esteemed dignitaries once again. And with that, I will now hand over the proceedings. But before that, I think we should do a group photograph. So I would request all our speakers, our moderator, our chair, to please switch on their cameras so that we can take a grid photograph over WebEx. So would request you to please switch your cameras on and please smile for us. Thank you very much. Thank you. And with that, let me now request Dr. Tongya to kindly take over the proceedings, our moderator. Sir, please.
Thank you, Aishwarya. And it is my distinct pleasure to be here with a very, very distinguished group of experts, regulators, people who make the decision on a very important but at the same time challenging topic, which is how do we regulate for the very high renewable energy ambitions that are there in the country. And of course, while we focus on India at this experience, a lot of the lessons we have would apply globally. I know we have a lot of participants from around the world. And before I hand over to our chair to give just some opening remarks and thoughts, I wanted to just lay a little bit of context as a researcher, as an advisor in this space for now several decades, which is we're not just talking about historical renewables. So a couple of things are changing, have changed, or will need to change when we think about renewables of the future. The old renewables were A, very expensive. They are now the cheapest new build, especially without a battery. They are no longer a fringe player, but if you look at India and many countries, almost all the growth of capacity is now coming from renewables. At the same time, the ambition, so India is targeting about 450 gigawatts of renewables or 500 gigawatts of non-fossil by 2030, as per the Prime Minister's announcements at Glasgow COP26. And achieving them will be not just a technical and financial challenge, but ultimately all of these tie back to the regulatory regime environment that helps guide investments, prices, returns, risk, all of the above. And also issues of equity, which I'll briefly touch upon. The old India was one where we had shortfalls, load shedding as it was called, a euphemism for brownouts. And the solution to that problem was more. You just add more capacity. That is no longer the problem. In fact, we have non-performing assets, quote unquote, too much supply built, especially recently. Now, the new need is not more energy or kilowatt hours. It is having sufficient capacity to meet demand instantaneously at every time, at the right place, with the right characteristics, right control, right ramping, etc., all put together. India is embarking on a program to try and have roughly 50% of its generation by 2030 coming from traditional renewables. So that's excluding hydropower. And so the regulations are a very key part of it. And I'll hint at why. Because it's not just based on having enough balancing capacity from other technologies. So I've mentioned the right time. So time of day electricity pricing will become key. We already have seen in many parts of the world where you have wholesale markets that dominate pricing for procurement of electricity, where the prices of power purchased by the discoms fluctuate based on supply conditions. So what that means is, in the middle of the day, occasionally your price in the grid wholesale falls to zero or even negative prices, which we've seen in parts of the US, parts of Europe occasionally. So it is not infeasible if we achieve our ambitious targets of 450. Now, it may take whatever time frame it does, few years plus or minus, but in such a scenario, we will have a world of curtailment, which is too much RE, which needs to be, or which will be thrown away, quote unquote. So the marginal cost is actually going to approach zero in periods of surplus. That is a whole new paradigm which we have not grappled with in the Indian context. A reality that current pricing regimes have missed are in several fold. First, we are not yet pricing for system level costs. Most pricing is done by levelized cost of energy, LCOE. What that means is, who can build the cheapest solar plant? There are bids raised and we compare their price. What we do not do is look at the prices of all the alternatives holistically, nor do we look at system level costs, which means that if I add renewables, am I then imposing costs on the rest of the system, be it on transmission, be it on balancing, etc. So as renewables grow, their marginal cost of integration rises and their marginal value declines. The last point I wanted to flag, and maybe I would request our chairperson, honorable chairman, to just speak about this, and also our other regulators. How do we handle equity in a high renewables world? Now, I'm not talking about the sort of just transition issues and coal mining and miners and that side of it. Just with the RE lens, how are we keeping pricing, especially to consumers, fair? If you look at rooftop solar, people worry about the so-called utility death spiral, that the cream of your customers will exit the grid and go for rooftop solar or self-generation, or behind the meter, to be more accurate. So the government of India at the central level has announced 40% capital subsidy for rooftop solar. And my worry is, are we subsidizing the rich? So in closing, some of the rhetorical questions to our esteemed plenary keynote presenters: is this something that just the market will figure out? Or do we need to tweak the markets? Or how much do we need the role of regulators? And how do we interplay central ambitions and state realities? With that, I thank everyone for their attention and look forward to a very great discussion. So the format would be, after the opening remarks from the chairperson, I would request all of our speakers to give brief opening remarks, such that we have time for several rounds of interactive discussions before we open it up to audience Q&A. With that, Hussain Saab, if I could request you to share the chairman's remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rahul. Can you hear me? I'm audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Very good evening to all of you. Good afternoon, rather. Mr. R.P. Singh, Mr. Neil Chatterjee, Mr. B.N. Sharma, and all other distinguished experts, speakers, and including the moderator. One of the 8th Millennium Development Goals adopted by the United Nations is to ensure environmental sustainability, and to achieve this goal, one of the major drivers is green power. As on today, India has 395 gigawatt of installed capacity, out of which 152 gigawatt is renewable energy, constituting solar, wind, hydro, etc. The theme for ISUW 2022 is Green Grid with reference to the regulators, and DRC is Delhi Electricity Regulatory Commission, being a regulator, has framed various regulations for promotion of green power in Delhi, like renewable power purchase obligation, net metering, virtual net metering, group net metering, and has also allowed DISCOMs to source cost-effective green power from various parts of the country. We are glad to see the progress of net metering in Delhi. Delhi, being a land-packed state, has scope only for the rooftop solar PV. On account of innovative net metering regulations framed by DERC in the year 2014, and with support of consumers and DISCOMs, the net metering capacity installed is around 165 megawatt in Delhi. Further to net metering, there is also virtual net metering and group net metering policy in Delhi, where the benefit of net metering is provided at different draw and injection points to consumers. DERC is the first commission to implement virtual and group net metering, and there is installed capacity of around 5 megawatt to this account. Parallelly, we have also requested various authorities to surrender the costly and outlived coal-based power plants supplying power to Delhi. This step will further reduce our dependency on fossil fuel and will promote green power, leading to sustainable environment. Today, I congratulate India Smart Grid Forum for organizing this event and setting up the tone for evolution of green grid of 21st century. At this juncture, I cannot restrain myself from going back to the larger context of the rural India. We are sitting and looking at the green revolution and green energy, but still there are villages and parts of India where we have not been able to fully electrify uh, the the houses, and there is no electricity for hours together, and there is no electricity connections for in several of the houses, though we on record we say that the whole of the country has been electrified. So simultaneously we should also be concerned about the basic needs of this country, and we can't have a saying as the French queen had said, if they don't have bread, why don't they eat cakes? So while talking about big things, we must not forget the conditions of India, and we must deliberate on that issue also. I think many experts are there, and I throw it open to them to take on from here.
Thank you, Hussain Saab. We will, in the discussions, I hope, get back to the issue of net metering, because it's a very key aspect from the consumer point of view. But of course, a lot of our renewables are not behind the meter or consumer, but grid scale, utility scale projects in India thus far. The other point, which is very key, what you flagged, thank you for that, is the quality of supply issue. So it is absolutely correct that even though many homes, most homes, if not nearly all, have a connection, are they actually receiving quality supply? Not just supply, but quality supply. So now the question ahead of us is, as renewables grow, does that create different or newer pressures upon maintaining quality supply, especially for an evening peak? Because India's peak is still in the evening. It is heavily air conditioning driven. So does that mean we are inevitably looking towards storage technologies which have a cost, at least a high cost in the short, medium run? So with that, thank you for your remarks. And I would now like to invite Sri R.P. Singh, Chairman UPERC, an expert both from the administrative side, but also finance and regulation, to share his thoughts from a UP and or national perspective. Sir, you're muted. Sorry, we're not able to hear your audio. Is anyone else able to hear the audio? No. Sir, would you be able to change your microphone settings, perhaps?
I'm changing
Yes.
that. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for giving this opportunity. Definitely, green grid is an area where everyone is interested. But as a regulator of a state like Uttar Pradesh, where we have got energy security and equity issues, we consider availability and affordability of energy to be of prime importance. And in that context, renewable energy are only a mean of attaining that, is not an end in itself. For us, energy equity is an end itself, not the mean. Coming to the point of green grid, I think, is an area where a lot of work needs to be done. We have done some work, but the scope is vast. Currently, we have roughly 25% installed capacity coming from the renewable side, excluding the hydro, and 10% of the energy, which has been uh, projected to grow to 50% by 2030. In that context, a lot of actions are required from all ends, including the regulatory side. Some of them definitely we have discussed, but those points which are equally critical and which have not been discussed, I'd like to point some of them so that we also give some attention to that, because our focus is primarily on the supply side, that we keep on installing the renewable energy capacity without thinking in terms of consequences, how it is going to be absorbed in the grid. The first issue is grid management and system operations action, which is required by us. It's a low capital cost option, and which may need some significant changes to in our institutional context. Like, for example, the grid codes of the CERC and SERC, they need to be further amended. Some of the states, including us, we have already put in place renewable energy, solar and wind forecasting, scheduling, dispatch, and accounting regulations. And we have also brought the DSM framework, the Deviation Settlement Mechanism framework, for the solar and wind. Because till such time it was insignificant, we could have managed without any deviation settlement mechanism. But now it has become significant. In that context, regulations for DSM and their scheduling forecasting has become essential. Although it's a must run, but that needs to be scheduled and forecasted. And because of increasing penetration of the renewable energy, the pressure on conventional has increased, and the renewable is occupying, because the demand is not growing in the anticipated projection. And the new capacity which is being added is displacing the existing conventional, leading to a lot of pressures on the economic dispatch side. So that area we have to work out appropriate mechanism and regulation, that how this is going to be addressed. And then again, as Rahul has pointed out, we do not have any framework presently existing for a strategic RE curtailment, because RE, the variability is there, lot of uncertainty is there. So we need to develop some framework for RE curtailment. To meet the grid stability criteria, the ancillary services needs to be augmented. Although CERC has come up with some framework to develop the ancillary services, but it is also required to be developed at the state level. And then there are issues related to voltage support and frequency support and upward and downward reverse dispatches, etc. One more point is related to your system flexibility, including your energy storage systems or grid interaction with the electric vehicles, etc. Demand response is yet to be addressed by any regulation as of yet. So these areas will have an impact on the stability of the grid. Now coming to the capital intensive aspect of greening the grid. The most critical aspect is augmentation and strengthening of the transmission system. Because the transmission system, the sources, the generation of solar and wind are location specific and the load centers are elsewhere. So the transmission investments are required which need to evacuate those powers which are generated by these renewable sources. The problem is that the transmission assets which are being set up, currently the government of India, in order to promote, is virtually giving it, ISTS has been notified as free for 25 years. So although it is free to the RE generator, but ultimately the cost is socialized on the consumers. So this is something which is creating some sort of opaqueness and some sort of problem for those who are non-beneficiary of the RE. Transmission system upgrade are required to be developed for that, and use of energy storage for virtual power plant to reduce the transmission bottleneck, etc. We have to work out regulations for that. Another aspect is that we have to work out the ramp up and ramp down requirement for higher and higher integration of the renewable energy. The existing ramp rate which has been prescribed by the CEA, and if we want to go to 50% renewable, perhaps it will be very, very critical that because the gas capacity is not adequate enough to handle to that sort of energy requirement, and unless until storage comes in, it will be very, very difficult to meet the ramp up and ramp down requirement. And I think on the distribution utility side, most of us have already addressed the issues related to rooftop solar, gross metering, net metering, etc. That is almost acknowledged. RPO has been done, and the concepts of qualified coordinating agency for small renewable energy generators have been brought into picture. And we in our state have already conducted a pilot for peer-to-peer energy trading, and open access energy banking is also allowed. So that these are the regulatory aspect I thought must be addressed so that we reach the level of target which is anticipated. And another last point I think I'd like to highlight is that we have to move towards the smart grid so that it can absorb higher penetration of renewable energy. But the pace of smart metering is not catching up to that extent. So that is another area we have to flag. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very insightful and I'm guessing battle scar driven remarks. Now, we'll hopefully come back to these issues of pricing, time of day, gross net, because they're very critical from a systems point of view. You've rightly pointed out that most of the effort has just been on the supply side. So the management side pricing relationship is something we'll come back to in the discussion. I want to come to you with one follow-up, which is you mentioned that there's a lot of support mechanisms like free transmission and so forth. And the economists like to always point out there's no free lunch. So someone somewhere else is paying with it. So as a regulator, we know that there are costs upon generators who have to back down. The efficiency of thermal plants falls, the O&M rises, etc. And if you actually come to a scenario of daily start stops of thermal, for example, then the costs rise much more than just a few paise efficiency hit on the generators. Are the regulators planning to just, Well, A, have they thought about these issues? And if so, is the easiest solution just to pass through all of these costs to raising the price of the thermal? Or would it be something that we should impose back upon the RE?
It's a very, very ticklish question for us. Renewable is marketed as a cheaper generation, cheaper electricity, because the cost of generation has come down to 2 rupees 50 paisa. But the hidden cost, actually, if you load it into it, then it becomes slightly expensive, because there are system balancing costs, which is significant, at least to the tune of 1 rupee 12 paisa as per the last estimate by CEA, which involves these costs of balancing, etc. But one cost which is not taken into account is the stranded capacity cost. If you look at the national perspective, we have got more than roughly 400,000 megawatts of installed capacity, out of which 250 is the conventional and roughly 100,000 is the renewable, and balance 50 is hydro. So our demand has never, except for few hours, our demand has remained less than 200 megawatts. So you can imagine the level of redundancy or non-performing assets in your work, which is already there. So that cost is already been loaded on the consumers. And the growth in the energy sector is not taking place because of the affordability aspect. What is happening that everyone globally is capable of absorbing more renewable, because they have got capacity and willingness to pay for higher tariffs. But in our country, where per capita income is of a low income country level, meeting that cost becomes very difficult challenge. So unless until government comes up and subsidizes that, the demand will not pick up, and we'll keep on adding more and more in renewable energy. That will put financial pressure on the DISCOM. So the most critical thing is that the paying capacity of the consumers and the subsidy being provided by the government should be supplementing these things, but that is not happening. Government, instead of paying subsidy to the renewable generator, is socializing that. That means it is being passed on to the rate users. So that is one issue which perhaps we have to address.
Thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but this issue will only grow as the scale of RE rises. So hopefully we will also hear from other regulators and experts in the panel. Thank you. Neil Chatterjee, I believe, is running late. If he's in the US, it's very early in the morning. And Shri B.N. Sharma will also is running late. So perhaps I could now request Sadamori-san to share some remarks, his plenary address.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to all. First of all, thank you to India Smart Grid Forum for inviting the IEA to be part of this discussion on regulation for modern green grids. We recognize the tremendous significance of India's announcement that it aims to reach net zero emissions by 2070 and to meet the 50% of its electricity requirements from renewable energy sources by 2030. The Indian energy demand is set to grow more than that of any other country in the coming decades, while renewable electricity capacity is growing faster than in any other major economy, with new additions on track to double by 2026. This rapid growth in renewables, the energy demand, and electrification of end uses, coupled with the need to expand the access and ensure more reliable supply to support the socio-economic development, requires the urgent and profound transformation of the electricity sector. So this calls for smarter digital infrastructure to manage more complex power flow and more flexibility options for power systems with large shares of variable renewable energy and increased the electric consumption, thus lowering the system investment, operating costs, and CO2 emissions. The Indian states have a range of potential sources of power system flexibility at their disposal and should identify the optimal mix to use, which will differ for each state. Options include thermal and hydro capacity, batteries, interconnections to increase the interstate and the international power trade, and demand-side responses. The shift by demand sectors from the passive electricity consumptions to more proactive participation will be an important element of power system transformation. An IEA analysis foresees active involvement by the agriculture, buildings, transport, and industry in balancing power supply and demand by 2030. The rollout of advanced metering and time of use tariffs will be central in enabling this activation of demand sectors. Policymakers thus have a pivotal role in ensuring that a conducive framework is in place for demand-side flexibility, and IEA welcomes India's important milestones in the 2021 revamped distribution sector scheme and the recently released Central Electricity Regulatory Commission's ancillary services regulations. However, the demand-side flexibility enabled by digital technologies still faces significant barriers in most countries, including the lack of innovation-friendly regulatory frameworks, limited access to market finances, public budget constraints, and the lack of strong business cases. So the countries can implement measures to fully leverage distributed energy resources and even end-use devices like the air conditioners or electric vehicle chargers to provide services to the power systems, such as the opening the wholesale power markets to aggregations of distributed energy resources, as the United States did in 2020, or implementing guidelines for the connected devices to provide demand-side flexibility underway in several countries. The private sector and the public-private partnership can help fill the financing gaps and accelerate the deployment of key digital technologies through the innovative business models. For example, the IntelliSmart, a joint venture between the Indian ESCO Energy Efficiency Services Limited and the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, was established to deploy the smart meters through a build, own, operate, transfer model, which is helping to remove the barriers to funding often faced by the utilities and to scale up the technology deployment. The IEA also welcomes the India's recently announced battery swapping policy to stimulate the uptake of electric vehicles, a potentially huge distributed energy resource to support the more flexible green grid. Disruptive technologies like the artificial intelligence, machine learning, and Internet of Things could also be leveraged through the new business models, such as aggregating distributed energy resources like batteries, rooftop solar, and EVs as the virtual power plants. And that's being tested in Australia, China, and the United States. And they are enabling the peer-to-peer energy trading schemes. At the IEA, we continue to work on these topics under the Digital Demand-Driven Electricity Network Initiative, 3DEN, and we look forward to collaborating further and learning from the excellent progress already going on in India. Finally, we should take into account the broader socio-economic benefits of power systems transformation. Inclusive digitalization and clean energy policies can help combat energy poverty, support energy access, and create jobs. India is focusing on such issues, including under the recently released framework for decentralized renewable energy for the livelihood generation. At the IEA, we are focused on supporting people-centered clean energy transitions to see such opportunities. So we look forward to continuing this type of conversation with you on how to achieve the green grid in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sadamory-san. I think you also, I mean, in addition to a very wide canvas that you've laid out, you rightfully reminded us of the demand side. And for India, electric vehicles and air conditioning will probably be two very key drivers of instantaneous demand upon the grid. Now, India is ahead of many developing countries, both where it is achieved today and its ambitions are, of course, amongst the highest in the world. Especially for a developing region, a low carbon emitter. I mean, China is also by some measures a developing region, but from an emissions perspective, it is well above the world average. And so India is in a different category. There are countries with much higher renewables already than India. If you have just a minute, if I could come back to you right now, um, is it just that India will become like them over time? What are they doing differently? Or what are some thoughts or insights you have? You said one of the things that I noted was the business alignment and the regulatory frameworks. If you could just share a few more words towards that thought, because it's really key, because India is starting from a low base and it has a lot of opportunity to choose the path ahead.
I think that's a very important the question, and the point about this the green grids or the renewable deployments, they differ by countries, and it depends on the where the countries are located, the various endowments in terms of the renewable sources. Some countries are well endowed with the sunshines, like India, and also it depends on the kind of interconnections with the neighboring countries. So, for instance, in Europe, it has a very well established, well interconnected systems with kind of the integrated the power markets with the neighboring countries. So the countries can pursue the various renewable sources and other low carbon technologies. And in the case of India, I think that the India is so well endowed with solar, and some countries, some regions with wind power. But the big question is the kind of interconnections amongst the among the states, and the neighboring countries is also kind of could be an important part, even though the interconnections with the other countries often has some kind of a geopolitical implications, and some parts could be rather difficult for India. But I think that what is important is that India has a very ambitious kind of a renewable target, and it has a chance of somewhat leapfrogging the other countries are kind of the advanced economies, and should be able to reduce the dependence on the fossil fuels, including the coal-fired power plants. But I think for that, there needs to be rapid progress in various flexibility sources for the entire renewable power systems.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I could now request Jean-Michel Glachant, Professor Glachant, uh, good to see you again. And you, as an expert, both academic but real world, and as an advisor, would love to hear your thoughts about the larger issues, but more specifically, if you could also just think through with an Indian hat, because India's trajectory is obviously a little different than many other countries. So what are the lessons? What did other countries do? Or how should India? I mean, we know where we are. We know sort of where we want to get to, but what we don't know is how we get there. So with those sorts of teasing questions, request you to share your address.
Raoul, dear Indian experts and many Indian friends. Unfortunately, Raoul, I've been asked to prepare something else, and I cannot change my mind at the last minute. It's impossible.
No, I did not mean to put you on the spot.
So,
Please share your
I've been
remarks.
asked to prepare what are the new types of regulation of the grids we can expect in this very big push to greening.
Thank you.
And from EU, I'm seeing three very changing and challenging regulations. The first one I call coupling regulation. The second one I call dynamic regulation. And the third one, behind the meter regulation. The first one is coupling regulation. Instead of having one sector only, being hierarchically organized and hierarchically regulated, we have several sectors coexisting, each with a different organization, a different regulation, but having to work together. That's a novelty. So coupling regulation is regulating for better interactions between several sectors, several systems. I will give example. In EU, typical example is offshore wind farms. We are willing to get 50 gigawatt offshore wind farm in 2030, 300 gigawatts in 2050, but offshore wind farm is totally new animal and the grid has to be conceived and built. In India, maybe, I do not know, it is your urban gas local grids, or it is your renewable mini grids or renewable microgrids, having to work with the old system. And in EU, we are also foreseeing the coming between year 2025 and year 2030 of local green hydrogen grids, another totally big revolution. The second one is dynamic regulation. Instead of having consumers being passive, facing a monopoly offer from the grid, from the system operator, or from one supplier, we have proactive consumers. They are able to react to any decision taken by an incumbent player by investing into assets and operating them. Decentralized generation, local storage, pushing to self-consumption, arbitrage by using storage, totally new. The third one, that I call behind the meter regulation, is the generalization of dynamic regulation. Instead of addressing electricity system management from within the closed doors of grid operation, we will have to address electricity system management beyond the meters, behind the meters. Where? In new open spaces of electricity consumption self-management. Behind the meter regulation is that we will have to foresee interactions with new actions from independent players, the consumers, typical electric vehicle managements, as batteries charging and discharging, as EV storage, vehicle to grids, but the same with buildings. Buildings can be managed as storage of heating and cooling. And on the top, utilities themselves can transform into ESCOs, energy service companies, professionally managing all the generation and storage assets owned by consumer and all the potential of consumption flexibility, creating a private third party to, if you know the term, transactive energy. Conclusion. Of course, these three novelties will act together, will interact, creating something much more revolutionary indeed, the 3D dynamic regulation, interacting in many directions. No time to speak about it, but if I come to ISUW 2023, I will give you a flavor. If I have 1 minute, I'm okay to come back to India. 1 minute?
we please.
So come back to India, you remember urban gas local grids, many renewables, micro-renewable, you have it. Dynamic regulation, I'm sorry, you have it. It has been said by so many speakers in this morning. Now, there is people, including in rural communities, looking at decisions taken by grids, by regulators, by suppliers, to see if there is an interest into investing by themselves and what to do with what they will get from their investments. And behind the meter will come just after. What is a community? A community is a bunch of people thinking, individually, we cannot do anything. Together, we can think. We can even think the way we consume, when we consume. Of course, at a community level, we can do, and it's the same in the EU. So it will come when, I do not know. How, I do not know, because I know too little about your country. But it's universal trend. And on the top, what I said this morning, you have excellent engineers in India. You have young people catching much better than me what is digital interaction, what digital apps created for India, created for people can deliver, and they will do. They will do for money, or they will do because they love their country, but they will do.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. And I didn't mean to have you deviate from your remarks. These were very helpful, but just were some probing questions based on the organic discussions that we had. If I could clarify one point that you'd raised, you mentioned coupling regulations. And from a power perspective, does that mean coupling all the way to fuel markets? Because in the Indian case, around 70% of the cost of electricity is procurement from the generators, even more than 70%. So of that, a big chunk would relate to coal prices, for example. So is that the extent to which you are talking about coupling?
Unfortunately, yes. We have thought in EU that we can refuse to look at fuels because fuels can be delivered by market. Yes, they are delivered by market, but which way? Can we put something as important as electricity in our day-to-day life, plus electricity as electrification tool, as IEA said? We're going to electrify the society. We do not master if the electricity sector is a given the primary resources, and we cannot master at what price. So we cannot do this. In India, you are lucky regarding coal, it is national coal. But regarding gas, you are like us. You take gas as it comes, when it comes, and because the geopolitics, let's be frank, the geopolitics of the world are changed. We are 21st century with new geopolitics. If you are sure that your providers are friends and guarantee security of supply, you only have a price issue, look at a long-term contract. If you are not sure that your suppliers are friends, which is the case in EU now, but what do we do? So it's so important to be sure that we have to think at coupling the upstream and the downstream, regarding my view.
Absolutely. And I mean, the current crisis has only amplified it. But even before that, the winter this year had fuel prices in Europe spiking to record levels.
You cannot believe it. It's beyond words. Huh? We now yesterday the French wholesale market for power saying the price we can guarantee for you is 250 euro a megawatt hour. If we have no spikes, if everything runs smoothly, you will pay 250. Is every spikes? We do not know. That's where we are in Europe.
Yeah. And in a high RE world, that volatility may be enhanced. So thank you, Jean-Michel. If I could now, if I could now request Ganesh Srinivasan, TP DDL CEO, to share his remarks. I'll thank you, Ganesh.
Thank you, Rahul. I'll just use a couple of slides if you're okay with it.
Please, do you have I mean, I hope yes, presenting is started.
Yeah, no, okay, fine. Yeah, thank you. So firstly, thank you very much, ISGF team, and my greetings to Honorable Chairman, DRC, RP Singh ji, Sen ji, and all the other esteemed panelists. I have a very few slides that I will try to share here. If you can go to the next slide, please, we can go ahead. Actually, Bindu, I will share a slide. It's a little shorter version. Knowing the time, if you can unshare, I will quickly switch over to my version, please. Yeah, is it visible now?
It is.
Okay, thank you. So this is just a quick snapshot of coal power capacity addition that has happened in the last 10 years. And actually, this is just something that is quite fascinating, that the first half of the decade, where we added somewhere between 15 to 20 gigawatt a year, which is down now trickled down to 7, 5, 4, etc. And the right side is the share of coal capacity as a percentage of total installed capacity. So we are kind of back to where we were at 2010, and this is with about the current installed capacity that we have, which is about 40% of our renewable, or our capacity is renewable. And with it going to about 500 gigawatts, the RE capacity will be somewhere close to 70% of the installed capacity. So it's really quite a change in terms of the energy mix that we see. And as far as regulations are concerned, there are a few things that we believe that are required as we go forward. And I'm thinking about it in 4 dimensions. On the supply side, on the demand side, technology, and as my esteemed panelists have spoken, on the grid flexibility aspect. So the regulations have to address, I have already addressed many of this, but of course, the transition from 100 gigawatt to 500 gigawatt will need a sea change in terms of the things that need to be done. So I'll start first with the demand side. The demand is both from the discoms as well as from the end consumers. So obviously the biggest elephant in the room is the health of the distribution companies. Now, till the time the health of the distribution companies remains perilous, it is difficult to keep increasing this share. There will be issues that will come up by discoms as well as by the generator. So I think the new scheme that is coming up aims to resolve this, but this remains the real elephant in the room, which can come in the way of any green transition that we envisage. The second aspect that I wanted to highlight is the long-term trajectory for the RPO. Currently, most states have a visibility of somewhere 2 years from now. But if we really have to go towards 500 gigawatt, while theoretically the case for RPO, a need for RPO may keep reducing as you rightly said, the new build cost of renewable becomes cheaper. But there are other aspects such as the coal-based capacity or the thermal capacity, which will probably retire much later in the 2035-40 time frame. So for discoms to keep adding capacity without demand will be a challenge. So there is a need for a longer term RPO trajectory, much beyond current dimensions. And from an end customer perspective, mostly from an open access perspective, what is required is stability of open access regulations, whether it is the surcharges or the way both the customers are treated, the subsidized variety as well as the subsidizing category. How we look at the round the clock customers, open access customers, the partial open access customers. It's very, very important to have stability. And this is something that is quite difficult to achieve in the current scenario. Now, on the supply side, I think this is again one of the elephants in the room, is the adherence to PPA conditions with respect to curtailment, attempts to renege on PPAs. A lot of work has been done, and support of the Ministry of Power and APTEL with respect to state regulatory order commission, orders of the regulatory commissions. But nevertheless, this remains as a major concern in adding new capacity across the country. Certain states do not renege, but there will, if you have to achieve 500 gigawatt, it can't be just a few states pulling their weight. A new RE capacity is being signed up by states. There is also a concern or an expectation that tariffs will keep getting lower. Of course, this is quite debatable in the current world, where the commodity prices have substantially increased in the last 6 months. At the same time, there has been customs duty imposed on cells and modules. So the waiting that we saw, that okay, maybe the prices will go lower, continuously go lower as the return expectations by the industry keeps getting moderated. But there will be a floor, and this is something that not a regulation point, but something important to keep in mind. Another aspect, of course, we talked a lot of, this is more about the grid scale power. but also to encourage supply on the rooftop based on the pilot given by approval of the Honorable DRC. Tata Power DDL had conducted a rooftop peer-to-peer trading pilot where the prosumer and the consumer directly trade with each other. The DISCOM acts as a facilitator. Such sandbox experiments can be scaled up. We have estimated that close to 30% increase in rooftop capacity can happen because the business case becomes better for the prosumer as well as for the consumer. A third aspect, as I mentioned, is on the technology aspect. Of course, battery hydrogen, while baby steps have been taken, but the battery storage is a very critical aspect if we have to address the round-the-clock power requirement. And CEA has modeled or modeled that a need for about 27 gigawatts of storage will be required by the system come 2030. And one of the suggestions that we as an industry have is that the Power System Development Fund, which is contributed by all the distribution companies, is a very suitable fund for funding battery storage projects. Again, we had done a pilot based on the approval of the Honorable DRC with the collaboration of AES and Mitsubishi. But scaling this up will require more funding and usage of the Power System Development Fund, because battery storage is should be looked at from a system perspective rather than just a utilities perspective, the need for the system rather than a particular utility. So a fund like PSDF would be extremely helpful to meet these requirements. And finally, flexibility. As we all know, the renewable will add more uncertainties in the system, and distribution entities need to be ready for this. Again, with the approval of the Honorable DRC, we had conducted a pilot on distributed energy resource management, and we had ensured that customers are able to participate in a demand response, a behavioral demand response, and hence this sort of experiment needs to be scaled up through the critical peak pricing, critical peak rebate, and a meaningful time of day tariff, so that the distribution utilities have more weapons at their command to address any unforeseen uncertainties that will come up. So these are some of the implications in addition to what my esteemed panelists have also spoken. These are some of my opening thoughts, Rahul. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Srinivasan. If I could just follow up very briefly, you mentioned for near the end, in a very crisp slide, I must say the signal to noise ratio was immense in that one slide that you had. Critical peak pricing. So this is one of several innovations that I think we will need to examine, because the old pricing was just averaging. At the extreme, it would be what R.P. Singh called socialization. And so we will have to move away from that. Has the regulator approved critical peak pricing for you, even for a pilot, or have they given any thoughts towards it?
No, the pilot that we had done with the approval of the Honorable DRC was with funding from Shakti Foundation and another US-based company called AutoGrid. So this was a pilot, and the results of this pilot have been shared with the Honorable Commission, and we look forward to working with them to ensure that it can be scaled up so that the proper critical peak pricing can be put in place. So that we can scale it up to a larger quantum of customers. Currently, it is not it's not approved by the Regulatory Commission yet.
Thank you. I mean, in the short run, quote unquote, short run, it seems that critical pricing may not be as big a deal in the Indian context because we've had a surplus by and large, I mean, in aggregate. But going forward, as demand grows and yet coal does not grow, you've shown, for example, coal is not growing and the firm power is not growing as much.
Exactly.
Then critical and variable pricing will become more and more critical. How far out do you see that becoming really key? I mean, I don't think it's a next 1 year, 2 year problem.
Rahul, see, I think it's not being driven by immediately by renewables, but if you look at what happened immediately after last monsoon with the kind of coal scenario that we had in the country, the critical peak pricing is a weapon or a tool that can be there with utilities to deal with those kind of situations as well. So it's not only about, even today, if you look at the gas prices that even Professor Jean-Michel spoke about, the gas prices are at an astronomical level today. And even if the plants have to run at a technical minimum, it's really at a very, very high cost that is being borne by the end consumers. So it's not only a renewable issue, the critical peak pricing, it also, the need for that becomes much more as the renewable grows. But in the volatile commodity situation that we are in today, it's required even when renewables is at the current stage of penetration.
Thank you, Ganesh, for pointing out and reminding us that it's not just an RE issue that needs a lot of change in the Indian grid. RE is just one of many changes that are occurring or driving the change. It's a coupled thing. It's both driving the change and it is the change. So thank you for that. I would just like to share with our participants and the audience that our Honorable Chair may need to leave soon. So thank you for the remarks in case you have to leave, sir. But if you're able to stay, great, to the extent that you can. If I could now turn over to Rajat Sarawat for your remarks. You are, of course, focused on Australia, which is in some ways a niche deployment, but it has been a pioneer. Rooftop deployment is very high in Australia, and with storage, they've done remarkable things. But again, those are just anecdotes. I don't mean to divert you from your remarks, Rajat.
Rahul, just confirming you can hear me. All right, thank you. And thank you everyone for inviting me to join this forum. I'm truly humbled to be in such esteemed company. Let me give a little bit of perspective, and I'll
Sorry, your audio is lagging. Maybe it would help if you switched off your video. Do you want to try that? It's breaking.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, please continue.
See if you can hear me now.
Better.
Good?
Yes.
Right. Thank you. So a little bit of perspective and a context from Australia. What we have here in Australia is the highest uptake of rooftop on a per capita basis in the world. So every third house in Western Australia, where I am, has rooftop solar. And that's great because DER helps in achieving sort of net zero aspirations everywhere in the world. And importantly, it actually also helps reduce costs. People are making decisions not just purely on environmental reasons, but on economic reasons. It's lower cost. And so the the benefit of having rooftops is huge for both economic and environmental reasons, but it does come with some real challenges. And the so-called duck curve is most prominent in Australia, where the demand really drops during daytime and picks up during the evenings. And it's most prominent here, and that's causing significant challenges for system security and reactions to that. The reason that perspective is important is because when you consider how other countries, including India, is going and where they're going, Australia, on a per capita basis, as I mentioned, provides a very useful insight into what the future, perhaps not too far distant, but what the future looks like. And here we see the DER, other technological disruptions, things like two-way markets, which was brought up, I think, by Ganesh, battery storage, the interactions with batteries in the market, issues relating to electric vehicles. I mean, we can go on, but there's a lot of technological disruption happening, and the disruptions both in a technical and an economic sense. I'm no engineer, no technician, and so I'll leave technical discussions to someone much more informed than I am, but I am a career economic regulator. So the key message I want to bring in here is, as far as economic regulation is concerned, we should be focusing not on going and chasing up every little problem and finding an administrative solution to that, but standing back and saying, how can we form an enabling regulation or a policy that allows the market to find the solutions? It's only when there is a genuine market failure issue that regulators need to step in. And what we find is typically regulators we have a tendency to go in and solve the problem, because as soon as we see a problem, we go in and solve it, and we provide an administrative solution to it, and that means it creates another problem, and then we have to go and find another solution to that. And so it's it's a recurring problem that really we always playing catch up, and because that's in a way slightly easier to do, and finding those enabling policies and regulation is a much harder one to do, and it requires confidence in the market. There's a lot of hesitancy in doing that. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I guess the key message is markets are amazingly resilient. They will find the right solution. Producer surplus is not a bad thing, but intervention in the market should only be where there's market failure, as opposed to regulation going in and being a substitute to regulation. And that message is even more important now when we're seeing all these disruptions coming in, and we don't quite know how to handle this. And we're doing it on a daily basis. Like we'll come up with a solution today on something, and then some solution again tomorrow. So that's my key message that I wanted to put forward to you.
Thank you very much. I fully subscribe to your view that we should use regulations like a scalpel, not like a broad sword, keep them precise. But the flip side of that is we need to be pricing correctly for the markets to work correctly. And today, at least in India, we have a whole range of distortions, especially on retail pricing, but even in wholesale and many other aspects. So yes and no would be my sort of reaction. We can get to that in the discussion session. But just following up from what you presented, 1 out of 3 homes, you say, has rooftop solar. Did I get that right, in Western Australia?
That's right.
Now that's a remarkable penetration. I think our Indian colleagues would sort of, their eyes must be wide open, mine are. And if you can just share a few words on what has that done to the utility or to the average pricing, because, I mean, utility debt spiral is a well-known theoretical construct. It may not actually be necessarily accurate, but it's a construct. But do you have time of day pricing for end users? Because the question becomes what the US has been grappling with, California is in a big fight right now over these, in fact, is if the consumers are treating the grid like a battery. With solar, you have a time of day inherent aspect. Shouldn't they be paying the grid for it? Or the flip side is, shouldn't the pricing that the grid gives for the market to work well, should that not reflect surplus in the middle of the day and deficit, duck, and ramping in other periods? How is that playing out?
Absolutely. I think you've touched on some really good points. And that is my, I guess the first response is that is my thesis here, that rather than regulators setting the prices, let the market determine the prices. And the market will determine most cost-reflective prices with sending the price signals that will change the behavior of the consumers and the suppliers. Now, what we have is we don't have a genuine value put to system reliability. And so, in the past, at least in Australia, we've got used to getting inertia for free because traditional fuel-based supplies provided for free. Now we're starting to recognize that has a value. Reliability generally has a value. And now in Western Australia, we've recently come up with a ROC of market amongst other markets in the ancillary services. That's what I mean by providing the value and letting the market decide that. What it means in WA is that yes, prices are not cost reflective or indeed reflective of the behavior that we've seen. That's changing as AMIs are being rolled out. We're getting more and more. So in effect, at the moment, we're seeing subsidies to the people who want rooftops. They're getting it for slightly cheaper than they should be, because it's largely variable costs rather than fixed costs, which is how the network costs are. I won't go on too long, but I hope that answers most of your questions.
I mean, it does at a framework level. If you have data, we can get to it in the discussion, because certainly the variable cost is going to be a declining share of total costs in a grid that's high RE, because it's all fixed costs, it's all network costs after a point. So this is some shift that will be required. Thank you. If I could now request Shri R.N. Sen, former chairman WBERC, who also runs a very innovative group and newsletter on the energy sector, which I diligently read periodically. Sen's up.
Good evening, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I thank Mr. Rahul Tongia, the moderator, and the chairman who has just left, and all our panelists, distinguished delegates. I also thank Indian Smart Grid for organizing this type of seminar every year, and especially Mr. Regi Pillai for inviting me in this seminar to share my thoughts. I'll be speaking a totally different tone. Being a old regulator, I have been speaking constantly about the regulation and the power market and all those things and the growth of the power sector. Now we're talking about the environment. If we see that, we'll find that we have really shifted away from the environment, from the nature, for the last couple of decades, and we have manhandled, we have misused everything the way we could have done to get the best of our output. In the process, now we are talking about the greening the grid, greening the total energy sector, and so on, and including we are in the threat of really the diminishing of the rich, which is coral rich, which is one of the major protective of the environment of this world. Now, also if you look back to us, we find that we are very, very comfortable when we go back to the nature. Those who are living in the cities and the urban areas, they find that after some time we really feel very suffocated with our environment. And whenever we get the opportunity to holidays and nothing, we go to either up hills or go to the seaside or go to the deep forest to really relax and get back what we have been losing. Now, saying so, what I am really looking in the power sector is basically looking for the microgrids. The microgrids gives us the opportunity to be with the nature, to work with the renewable energy, whether it is solar or biomass or small wind turbines or small hydro, all those things. So many things also now coming up one by one. They will really give us the opportunity to be with the nature, use the natural resources, and do not depend on the fossil fuels, which really dictate not only our environment but also our economy, which is happening. We are finding that every time when there is a war or something goes up, the oil prices goes up, the coal prices goes up, everything goes up, and the people they grapple with the economy of the country. Along with we also pollute the whole environment of the world. Now, if we really switch over to the renewable through microgrid, we will be the periphery of the distribution utilities and also in the mid of the distribution utility, we will find that substantial amount of power is really getting from this renewable, and we are in a position to really support and greening the grid and really honor the commitment made by our Honorable Prime Minister in the COP26, which will really make India one of the leaders in the world. Now, what do you mean by grid? microgrid, building the microgrid, and all those things. Today, the microgrid is basically very limited in numbers and very standalone. They are working some parts of the countries where there is no grid connectivity. We are looking for a microgrid not only where there is no grid connectivity, also where there is a grid. Because the microgrid will be in a position to supply power from the solar during the day time, from the biogas and the other source of generation during different times of the day. But the main grid, the robust grid, what we are having across the length and breadth of the country, we find that it has a surplus capacity during the night time. Means when we have a technical minimum load, we have to maintain both in the thermal and also nuclear. There's conventional generators, some the wind, which really highly intermittent, and we have found that in the southern part of the country, wind generation maximum happen during the night times, and they generally vanish as the day comes. So we have a whole lot of power available, and that's why if you see that when you go to the power market, the night powers are generally very cheap. And if we really permit these microgrids to get connected with the main grid and develop a system through regulation and the policy where they will be basically taken as supporter of the grid, supporter of the environment, supporter of the distribution of the people across the length and breadth of the country so that they don't have to really migrate to the urban areas and cities. They continue to be in the place where they are. They continue to enjoy their surplus of their agriculture waste, the surplus of their cattle waste, the surplus of their whatever is really nothing and going to waste, those waste can also support them to have a good amount of livelihood energy and also in your fertilizer, biofertilizer, all those things which will be output of those, be gasifier. Now, what I mean by that, the moment we talk about this microgrid, the microgrid will be in a position to perform very well when we see all those initiatives which have been taken by the government of India in recent couple of years are implemented in the word and spirit. First, let us talk about the government of India has issued a letter to all the departments in the September, I think it's the 1st September 2021, by transferring all those distribution assets of 33 kV and above to the transmission utilities. Once that happens, and they have given a reason for that also, the reason they are given that it will certainly improve the financing of those transmission assets. They will switch over to the latest technologies. They will use the smart grid technology and all those things, and asset utilization will further improve, and everything will improve. So. But one thing I also see from them, basically, what I also earlier in one of my magazines we brought out very clearly that these transmission assets will certainly help those microgrids to get connected with them direct by not depending going to the distribution utility. So once they are directly connected, they will be in a position to source their power from any part of the country, whether it is a distribution utility or it is a remote corner of the wind power which is being generated in some part of the country. So this will have the basic advantage of getting the connectivity across the country and without depending on them. So this is first thing I feel that it should be implemented, and the regulators now should get actively involved on implementation of this order, which the transmission utilities may be interested, but the distributions are not. Now, the advantage is that those people who have been already working in the distribution utility in this area, they can go to the transmission utility, they can work in a much more professional environment, will be in a position to reduce the transmission losses and AT&C losses. What we found that in West Bengal and other part of the country also, the technical losses of the 33 kV system and of the distribution utilities are about 1 to 2% higher than the transmission utilities. So this amount of 2% losses can be saved, and the availability of the lines will be much more better, and they will be through a different networking system. The second thing, what I also request the regulators also, what I have also again repeated written in some of our articles came up by not only me, by some of our distinguished writer, that if we really go for de-licensing, which is a part of the Government of India, is your act, which is in the parliament. I don't know when it will see the light of the day, but if it comes, then we are going for de-licensing. Once we are going for de-licensing, automatically the transmission and distribution segment we are divided into three parts. One, certainly the 33 kV and above will go to transmission. Then all of us know that as far as the consumer is concerned, consumer pays for the last mile connectivity. This last mile connectivity means from his consumption point to the nearby distribution transformer. So this asset is not the asset of the distribution licensing. Though for the purpose of everything we consider as distribution license asset, and he gets the O&M cost, everything for that, but the asset can also go to a bank which can be managed by the regulator through administrator.
Direct sunlight, glass is
Sorry,
growing
could
beautifully
I request?
in
Sorry,
that low solar.
could I
These
request
holes here, no, the mounting may not be the
organizers?
right
Can you mute the mic
system
for
for
other
the
people?
farmers. You see that on that photo, that if the
I don't
farmer
have
is not
control
willing
to
to farm
mute
below the solar,
the.
this definitely doesn't work out.
Sorry for the
New
technical
plants popping
glitch.
up. This one close to
Shibuya,
Delhi here. There, this is being avoided.
if I could
So the
request the
farmer can
organizers to please
work
mute the other
below the
participants. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So now, let me come back to the point. So, the moment I see that this asset which are with the distribution of the consumers, they go back to the regulators through the administrator, and they are shared with the new distribution, what you call not licensee, distribution service provider. Then lot of things can be done, lot of issues can be solved. Yeah, I am ready to answer if anything you can, or I can keep it after some time. Mr.
So
RP
let's
Singh.
take it to the discussion maybe, because you flagged a whole new world of sort of
Yeah.
very different than the centralized system or traditional system that we have. So hopefully we can get to it. I see Mr. Shri RP Singh has his hand up. He would like to just comment. So,
Yes, I'm sorry, I could not stop myself from raising my hand. Actually, two of the statements which Mr. Sen, our senior colleague, made prompted me to do that. First was he referred to the use of central government's notification dated September 21st, which advises the state governments to transfer the distribution assets above 33 kV and above to the transmission company. Now, I don't know whoever has drafted that order or issued that order. He has not read the Electricity Act, because the distribution company asset cannot be transferred by the central government. These assets are of a body corporate which is owned by its shareholder, be it the private shareholder or the company. B, Section 17(4) of the Electricity Act prohibits that no asset of the licensee can be transferred without the prior approval of the appropriate regulators. So that advisory is totally illegal, and nobody takes any legal notice of such advisory as the state of affairs today. Second, he also made a point about de-licensing. How can, till such time there is Electricity Act which provides for license activity, we cannot imagine unless until the act is amended, repealed, or whatsoever. So I thought that we are straying into an area which is a wish list, because we cannot think of those things happening unless until the act is amended. So I thought I must step in and just clarify that at this stage only. Thank you.
Right. Shall I answer your queries and then go ahead, or Rahul?
we can come back in the discussion since we still have a
I can answer.
keynote.
Just take 1 minute or 2 minutes to answer these queries, and then I'll go ahead, because that will keep the other people mind bit. So as far as the issue of the notice is concerned, it has been issued on the advice of a committee. If you see the letter has written very clearly, the committee has advised, and based on the advice of the committee, the letter has been issued. And as far as the separation of the asset is concerned, certainly it requires the permission of the regulator, but the regulator, it is understood the regulator also will be working in the interest of the country. So they are not going to work in the against the country. And as far as the act is concerned, I also mentioned the act is in the parliament. I never said the act has been enacted. The act is in the parliament. We have been debated, we are discussing, and we know Mr. Harry Deol also knows that we have a platform in the different Indian Energy Forum and in power. Those so there we have been debating on those things, and we are hopeful that act will be.
I'll be talking for 2 minutes.
Okay, so Regi, he was talking. Yeah, please.
Yeah, good evening, good morning, Mr. Neil Chatterjee. He has just joined. Rahul, I would like to let you know that Mr. Chatterjee has joined. You can introduce him and then request him to speak.
Yes, I will as soon as he shows. I do not see him in the list.
No, he has joined on phone.
Oh, he's joined on the phone. Okay, so as soon
but he can listen to us now.
Sure.
I mean, let me finish because I'll take another 5-10 minutes. And
so we may not have as much time, but we can come back in the discussion because this is a complex issue on jurisdiction and regulation. I agree. A lot of these things are evolving. I think your point is very valid that obviously the Electricity Act is under amendment state. So it has not yet been amended. And these are many of the things being deliberated.
Yeah, I think we have already. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, we have already understood that the distribution sector is not performing, and they have been something like a what you call a pot without any bottomless pot. Whatever government is putting the money, that's all going into drain. So we have to have a different thing. We cannot continue with this way. We have been performing, we have been acting. So that's why these different thoughts. And the one thing is the moment we go to microgrid, or most of the the domestic consumers and the agriculture will really switch over from the distribution to the microgrids. And a lot of AT&C losses will be saved. You can work out the whole thing. It will be really beneficial for all. It is not that it is at the cost of somebody. It will be beneficial for, it is win-win for all. Okay, I will not take my more time.
Thank you.
So here I am ending my with understanding that if something comes, and we would like to deliberate and discuss. If required, I request Mr. Regi Pillai to form a small group. We can start first sharing our notes and then we can discuss our video conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senza. I think the larger point of changing relationships between the stakeholders and their incentives, be it need not be a microgrid alone. It could be from other third parties, self-generation. Delhi has done virtual joints. In Karnataka, we have group captive RE. So there's so many shifts from the traditional system that have happened around the country. Harry, if I could just hold on a few minutes since Neil is on the phone, maybe calling from the US. First request former FERC chairman Neil Chatterjee to share brief remarks. And for the audience, it's worth emphasizing that the US is a very good model to study for India because it is a federal structure with central jurisdiction. One of the key issues in India is really, in fact, literally the debate we were having thus right now, which is where do the boundaries lie, rights, roles, responsibilities, and abilities. And so FERC has issued some things towards high RE, how they treated storage. I mean, one of the rhetorical questions is storage a generation or a consumption or both? How do we regulate it? And FERC took a stand on that. But I'm not sure if that's what Neil would speak about. But Chairman Chatterjee, if you're on the line, please. Are you able to hear us, Neil?
Visible on the participant list.
He's joining by phone, Reggie mentioned. He's not there in the list of electronic AV joins. Reggie, can someone in the office or the back end just check? I don't hear Neil.
Yes, he can hear us. You invite him and you can introduce him. He will speak.
So as already introduced by our MC, Neil Chatterjee is the former FERC chairman, which is the central regulator in the United States. He served twice as the chairman, and he's also worked with utilities, rural cooperatives, as well as giving legislative support to the US federal government. Mr. Chatterjee, if I could request you to share some brief remarks. Reggie, you mentioned he can hear us, but we are not able to hear him. Reggie, are you the bridge to Neil? Do you have to unmute your mic if you're playing a bridge role? Is that the bottleneck? Sorry, everyone, for this technical glitch. We are spanning continents and platforms here. So this is like the interoperability challenge in disparate grids trying to speak to each other. Reggie, if you're able to hear me, would unmuting yours be required, or would Neil come in directly from a phone? You are muted, Reggie. Well, until that is sorted out, I apologize on behalf of the organizers. But meanwhile, if I could request Harry Dahl, who's the Director General of IPPAI, but in many ways he's an institution. He runs think tanks or contributes to thoughts and policies in the country on generation side, and probably has a lot of battle scars as well. Harry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was hoping that you could hear Neil Chatterjee, but anyway, thank you. Can you hear me, guys?
Loud and clear.
Okay. So I'm very confused, Stongia, because I've jumped from being an industrialist to the power sector in '86. And having spent more than 36 years in the sector, I'm very, very confused. But we're discussing today renewable energy and the way forward. I think it's an extremely important subject, but I'm still confused. There are a couple of issues which bother me. So let me just start off on somebody who wrote a small poem for me. It's about environment, so it'll just change the tenor for a minute. It says, I want to go green. I want to be seen. I want to go renewable. I want to be clean. And I want to save the world from the pollution that swirls. I want to be seen. I want to go green. That's a good intention. And it goes on and on. But, you know, while listening to all the speakers, it was a sense of deja vu. Having worked with the regulators in the days when the regulators didn't even have an office, and poor guys had to request a section officer for their petrol bills to be filled, to today where regulators have extremely evolved. We've got technology, we've got information flowing. Having seen the Electricity Act being considered originally Electricity Act 2001 and finally declared in 2003 on a conditional basis, I'm finding that the implementation and the concept of, or what is conceptualized, there's a big gap. So while we talk about renewable energy, it reminds me of trying to fix a square peg in a round hole. And why do I say that? I'm saying that because originally renewable energy, which is intermittent in its nature, used to be banked with the state discom. And because it was banked with state discom, the late Gajendra Haldia and I used to discuss this, and we actually come up with this concept where if you bank at a certain time, then that price is what is the value of the energy that you banked. For example, if you bank in the off-peak hours, you cannot draw that power at the same rate in a peak time. Fair enough. So it is very simple to do that. And somebody else, one of the speakers said that you use the state discom as a banking agency. And that was a natural process. But what are we trying to do here? Now we've got rooftop solar. And who's upset about it? The discom. Why? Because his paying consumers are going away. What else have we got? You got renewable energy versus thermal. Thermal is being used for backing down and ramping up and ramping down depending on the way it flows. We are finding that the thermal guys are having to sometimes go below the technical minima, and they're not getting adequately compensated, so they say, for the excess fuel consumption. Somebody also mentioned in the panel that there are people who are not taking into account various related costs to renewable energy. So you just look at the, they go to the regulator and say, renewable cost is going to be 2 rupees, 250, 3 rupees, and that's it. It's not, that's it. And as you rightly pointed out earlier on, the balancing cost of just the balancing cost is 1 rupee 10 paise, and I don't know how much is the cost for the depending on the region where you're operating from, what is the cost of the thermal power plants backing down and how much fuel consumption goes up. So you really have a competition, so to speak, silently as it goes on between renewable and thermal. And what is this competition, or what is this clash, if I can call it that, is that you are asking the world to get, or at least India to get renewably self-sufficient. You're trying to fix that square peg in a round hole, but at the same time, you're actually dependent on thermal to back you down, to give you a backup. Then you have the battle between renewable and thermal guys on transmission. And I think somebody very nicely put down the point that the thermal, the transmission systems need to be upgraded. I think this our honorable regulator from UP. Now, who has the first right of way? It's like a road, right? Does the truck have the right of way? Does the car have the right of way? Does the bicycle have the right of way? Who's going to have the right of way in times future when there are multiple schedules? Of course, you can always say must run, and you can always say all of those things, but there's obviously a cost. Then what else do you see? The point you mentioned about storage when talking about Neil Chatterjee. The Electricity Act 2003, fortunately, does not visualize a lot of things. But we are trying to fix those gaps, if you like, where storage is, I don't know, a generator, a consumer, or something else. And there's a very interesting discussion took place a couple of years back with one of the joint secretaries in MOP, who said, we've come up with the regulation that the moment energy is converted from electricity to chemical energy, second, storage is a service. Therefore, it's outside the Act. So I said, you know what? I'm confused, as I normally am. You're saying it's outside the Act. Fair enough. You're saying if I'm setting up a 500 megawatt hour storage facility, utility scale, and from the renewable energy, the power is flowing into that facility, you're saying it's outside the Act. Fine. Then from that facility to, let's say, a McDonald's or a Cafe Coffee Day or whatever else is there, is that also outside the Act? Somebody said the transmission charges are gone, but are the open access charges gone? Is the DISCOM going to allow this? And then we, of course, get into that whole battle which R.N. Sen was talking about, or center versus state. The poor state regulator is becoming, he's been asked to behave like a Superman. What does he do? He has to make sure that everybody is around and live, and we all want the DISCOMs to be around, otherwise we are out of business if you are looking as IPPs or as traders or whatever. Then what confuses me further is, in case we go ahead and issue a fatwa from the center, which state DISCOM is going to allow their paying consumers to go away from the grid? This was beautifully brought out in the early stages of the discussion. And I'm not very sure whether the DISCOMs are going to be very excited about this. I'm sure they'll find some way to block this or come up with this crazy idea. Two quick thoughts more. Smart metering, everyone's talking about slow, etc., etc. I'm getting worried between the Ukraine and the latest developments there. What's very worrying is the cyber attacks. So I'm just wondering whether we are getting ourselves into a lot of more vulnerability. We have to see the pluses and minuses. A discussion with the private DISCOM told me that there's not much of a benefit by putting in smart meters because we already had covered the transmission losses, etc. I'm not so sure, but I'm confused. And the last point, I discussed this with the Maharashtra regulator about 7 or 8 years ago, the need to develop a new idea called white certificates. And these are basically certificates where you trade energy that you save. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Harry. I think if I could oversimplify some of what you said, we certainly need to have greater consistency in our regulations, consistency from an objective, but also across the domains, subdomains, and stakeholders that are there. I mean, the government has had silo-based targets, whether it was for fuel, coal, RE, electricity growth, all of the above, but they don't necessarily work in tandem with each other. And that is something we must evolve. And another confusion, not to add to your list of confusions, is now green hydrogen is one of the pushes of the government policy, and that is going to achieve or receive free transmission, free delivery of RE with 1 month banking based on a price equal to the differential between the market exchange. We can see that this makes a lot of folks sort of quizzical. And so I come back to the observation that there's no free lunch. It's free for one user, means someone else is paying for it. So
Yeah,
as regulators, as
but now
policymakers,
look at the problem the regulator faces. He doesn't know which way. What is the next 10-year trajectory, right? Except that we have RE targets to achieve. That's about it. And what does he do? Is he going to go on market-based pricing, or is he going on regulated pricing? I mean, he's got so many issues on his table. I mean, I admire
so
this
Harry,
guy.
you're stealing my questions that were there for the discussion.
I'm
But I
sorry.
would like to hear, in fact, unless Reggie, you're able to connect Neil Chatterjee, we were not able to hear him. We have only 10 minutes left for discussion.
In 5 minutes, he will be joining from the computer. So he had difficulty when he joined from the phone. So
Sure.
it's too early in the morning. It's just 7 o'clock. So now he's joining from his computer in another 2-3 minutes.
Sure.
So you can
We'll,
continue with
as soon
more
as we see
question
him,
answer,
yes,
and
we'll
he'll be
discuss.
in any time.
Correct. As soon as we see him, we can have his remarks. But now coming to the Q&A, I want to, again, at the risk of oversimplifying, bring us to where we are with RE and its growth, which is in the short run, everyone, or at least many people, love RE because it's cheap. It's cheap at the margin in the middle of the day, not necessarily at a systems level. It's cheap as it's signaled. But the issue is at the volumes that are envisaged 9 years hence, 8 years hence, it is not going to be the cheapest, and it certainly won't be the cheapest at every time of the day or at a full systems level. And so now the question becomes, how do we fix the signaling for it? TOD, have regulators thought about it? I mean, retail TOD is something states have. It's available for bulk consumers. But that's not the question at hand. It's the wholesale side of it that is much more complex. And the flip side of this is, Mr. Sen talked about environmental cleanliness. I always ask, how much of a premium are you meaning any consumer, willing to pay for cleaner power if there is a premium required? And to paraphrase what Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramaniam quoted on this topic, he said, it's like Saint Augustine, who is reported to have said, Lord, give me chastity, but not just yet.
Okay,
So
Rahul, that was
open
lovely.
questions. I mean, I'm not sure if people can turn on the video, it may be easier, but request very brief interjections from anyone who has some thoughts
Yeah.
towards this.
I alluded to that by saying banking, time of day banking to get the market price. So I just thought I'd like.
My point of view is that you are talking about time of the day metric for retail consumer. This is not feasible in the next 10 years. Simply, I'll tell you the reasons. The reason being that to have the time of the day metering, you need to have a smart metering. And in fact, not only smart metering at the retail level, in fact, all the your substations, your distribution transformer, everything needs to be smart. And that I don't see happening in next 10 years. So in absence of any smart meter, you cannot implement time of the day metering. Is virtually impossible to implement that. Even if you think of doing that, the cost will be prohibitive. So
But
let
what
us
about at wholesale level?
the wholesale level, then again it has to be socialized, because you don't know again, the shortest low hanging fruit in my opinion is carrier and content segregation. If we move forward through that route, and that was a low hanging fruit in 2014, I don't know why the government is taking versions after versions and bringing out a new set of draft amendment. This act has become redundant. That act was drafted when India was a power deficit country. Now India is a power surplus country. We need to move from regulated mechanism to market-based mechanism. And we cannot move to a market-based mechanism unless until we are stuck up with this act. This is long and short of my point of view. And coming back to the green hydrogen you are mentioning, this is the worst thing to happen, that it is burden. I compliment Mr. Harry for pointing out precisely. EV, green hydrogen, these are cross-sectoral issues. EV is a transportation sector business, and it is being, unnecessarily burdened on the power sector, because to integrate EVs, what is going to be your system augmentation cost for allowing, if you replace, even if you have 50% of vehicles to the grid, and one electric vehicle, 30 kilowatt hour battery, if you want to have a fast charger of 1 hour, you can imagine the load which needs to be added to the grid, and fluctuation which is likely to happen. That is number one. If you talk about green hydrogen, what is the electrolyzer efficiency? Nobody, the government of India has come out with a policy without thinking that 40% is energy is lost in one routing from RE to electrolyzer and then to back. So you roughly lose 40 to 50% of energy of the renewable energy is lost, which is much more than your transmission charges. So who is going to benefit? The industry is going to benefit. And who is going to bear the cost? ISTS is passed on to the non-user consumers. So these are the policy things which are being pushed in the name of clean energy, is not going to do well to the power sector, because till such time the power sector is healthy, it can support to that extent. But if you burden the sector with all the burdens of other sectors like electric vehicle and industrial burdens, then this will collapse. So this is two serious policy issues I thought I must flag in this forum.
Thank you. Ganesh, if I could come to you, because Delhi is turning into the hotspot of EV deployment in the country. It's had the highest share or growth for November numbers that I'd seen. And we're not at the point of the collapse, of course, yet, because it's still small. It's still in the early phases. But this prompts two sort of questions. The first is, how do we make sure that these are charged clean? If you charge them overnight, they're not going to run on solar. That's the first aspect. And the linked question from what Mr. Singh had just mentioned, we're talking about a lot of socialization. There is a cost, an augmentation. So today you have EV tariffs that are relatively low in many states. They're around 5.5 rupees typically. And that is clearly not cost reflective of peak power or augmented power when you need to upgrade infrastructure for, quote unquote, the richer consumers. It's not going to be everyone who puts up an EV. It's going to be certain pockets, localities, and so forth. So any planning, thoughts, experience, or concerns?
Yeah, thank you. I think what Sri R.P. Singh ji just mentioned, very rightly so. Just, of course, this is more of a sectoral issue, that the EV tariff, for example, in Delhi on LT and HT is about 4.5 rupees, right? Whereas the power purchase cost itself is about 6 rupees plus. And then you have the network cost and the other costs. So the average cost of supply is somewhere touching 8 rupees. So we are cross-subsidizing EV tariff by close to 4 rupees, no fixed charges, just a single part charge. So yes, at this point it is just a pinprick, a needle, but that needle prick will keep getting bigger. And I don't think I have an answer right now, Rahul. We are trying to achieve multiple goals at the same time. We want to increase EV penetration. It's even if it is charged by coal, Rahul, I would argue that in the particular case of Delhi, given the unique pollution issues that Delhi has, there is a case for even charging with brown power rather than only green power. So pushing the time frame out till we get more green power, would I think that I would say that it's still, even now there is a time for charging it with, and of course that means that pollution is higher somewhere else, but Delhi particularly needs this kind of system. But yeah, there needs to be a better handling or a phasing out of cross subsidy of EV. Particularly, it ideally should be at average cost of supply. That would be the right posture, similar to metro and other essential services.
But Metro has now started exiting, so they've gone for their own RE now.
They have their open access or captive open access, but
Right.
they still pay the wire charges that are as applicable to that voltage level that they drop.
Okay.
But cross subsidy charges are waived for RE then.
For yes, for captive RE, yes.
Yeah.
Captive.
Yeah. We've, I think, had a few people drop out. I think I don't see Jean-Michel because one of the follow-up questions to this market, since you talked about the need to move towards market mechanisms, and Rajat also emphasized, let's get the signaling right, then things will evolve in the correct direction. Now, one of the big challenges is that is the market sufficient to handle these externalities, network effects, or other things? It's not clear that they have been in the rest of the world. And second, markets have been insufficient for incentivizing new construction, because we're going to end up with very big dichotomy where in the middle of the day, you mentioned, Ganesh, off-peak is night. As of now, I think several folks, but that will evolve where from a net demand perspective, meaning post RE, meaning firm power after RE, your middle of the day is going to be your off-peak period, and solar is at a high. So that will then not give sufficient incentive to.
I think even now, the peak is both. There is an afternoon and evening peak is much higher than the night peak, afternoon peak actually, with the air conditioning load.
Yes.
Rahul, every state has its own load duration curve, and
Right.
it depends upon your consumer mix. Those states which have got higher industrial load, their peak occurs during daytime or evening time. But the states where the domestic consumer mix is very high, like in case of UP, the peak is on the night. In fact, in last two occasions when the national peak of 203 gigawatt was hit, our peak happened sometime at 11 p.m. So, that is, and during the daytime, what happens, most of the people, domestic load is almost switched off. And that is the time when solar is, just injected. So what Mr. Ranawat was mentioning, this inverted duct curve has already started happening in our state because of solar injection. Add to that, as we have already discussed, behind the meter injection is not scheduled. Nobody knows. It is neither forecasted nor scheduled. So these, as the rooftop penetration goes up, these fluctuations become much and much wider in swing. So these are challenges, but since the total energy which is injected in the grid is only 10%, but with every incremental 1%, I think the pain is going to take. For example, why Bombay had two grid failures in less than 1 year. Somebody should go and do the deep analysis rather than cover up. So these things will start happening more and more, and it will be reflected in some form or other. So we have to acknowledge those. We should acknowledge those challenges and try to address rather than working out a new way around.
Rahul, Neil is online.
Dr.
Yes,
Pongyan, Mr. Neil Chatterjee has also joined us
I'm
now.
aware. Yes. So we'll have to cut short some of our discussion. So one request to the organizers, as Mr. Sen suggested, maybe we need a deeper dive that's a roundtable format to thrash out some of these issues, because these are the key issues for the country going forward. But we're delighted to have former FERC Chairman Neil Chatterjee join us. Hello, welcome, and hello again. And if I could request you to share your opening remarks briefly for the panel.
Thank you guys for having me. Apologies, I was having some technical difficulties. It's very early here in the US, but appreciate your patience. It was 2 years ago this week. I was in Delhi for this conference, and who would have thought that was our last normal week, and we haven't had one since. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak here again. I was going to touch very quickly on some of the things that we have done here in the United States to remove barriers to entry to battery storage and behind the meter technologies. In 2018, during my tenure as chairman of FERC, we issued a landmark ruling, FERC Order 841, which removed barriers to entry to battery storage technologies to allow these resources to be compensated for all of their attributes, for capacity, for energy, for ancillary services. And in doing so, and in working with the regional transmission organizations that FERC oversees, we got to see the integration of and accelerated deployment of these resources, which are helping the U.S. move towards its decarbonization goals while maintaining reliability. That order was challenged by a number of incumbent utilities who were concerned that they would struggle to comply and implement the rule. And it was taken all the way to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. The DC Circuit sided with FERC in terms of jurisdictional questions of how far FERC could get into distribution. And that legal opinion was significant because it led to what I think was the most significant order that FERC has ever issued, certainly during my tenure. And in September of 2020, FERC issued a rule, Order 2222, which called for tariff changes to permit the aggregation of distributed energy resources in wholesale markets. Distributed energy resources are typically small-scale, behind-the-meter energy resources, such as rooftop solar panels. I mentioned battery storage installations, electric vehicles and charging equipment, and energy efficiency assets, including home appliances that have generally not yet had access or opportunity to provide services beyond their immediate proximity. The number and types of DERs are rapidly expanding and will continue to grow in 2022 and beyond. In fact, utility analysts and various reports state that the global annual investments in DERs are expected to increase by 75% by 2030. The continued falling prices of DERs, ambitious new state and federal policies, and customer demand are contributing factors to the growth of the renewable energy market. These trends are likely here to stay, and with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission carving out space in wholesale markets for the aggregation of DERs, a more competitive playing field is expected to create lower prices and more diversity of participation models, ultimately bolstering grid resilience and reliability. Where we stand now is the various regional transmission organizations and independent system operators are making efforts to implement the Order 2022 framework. All of the RTOs and ISOs are in the process of developing their implementation plans, but the timelines they're proposing may present a speed bump to the overall enacting of the competitive market reforms required by the FERC order. And this just goes to show you the complexities of making this kind of change in U.S. policy. But the issuance of FERC Order 2222 really did mark an important moment for DERs. It empowers the acceptance of new technologies. Once this framework is fully implemented, DER aggregators will be able to compete in all regional wholesale electric markets on the same footing as traditional power plants and other grid resources, which will open the door for distributed energy resource management systems to drive more value from these flexible resources. Until this point, wholesale energy markets needed to work through operational and technical constraints prior to establishing a framework for DER aggregations. Order 2222 prompted the implementation of proactive steps to open wholesale markets and instructed RTOs and ISOs to establish provisions in their tariffs to allow DER aggregations to sufficiently engage as market participants. Since the issuance of Order 2222, Grid operators have been developing these plans, and I look forward to discussing them should you all have any questions. Thank you again for your patience this morning and for the opportunity.
Thank you, Chairman Chatterjee. Very remarkable steps taken in the last few years to move the needle on enabling or removing barriers, to use your words, for clean technologies. Just one observation, it may not need an answer, but if you have thoughts, please do, is that if we get the pricing signals right, if we remove the barriers to entry, we can unleash a lot more innovation, new solutions, and things. The flip side of that seems to be that efficiency may lead to changes in social welfare equilibrium. Because in India, for example, we have enormous cross subsidies. There is heavy overpaying by certain users, commercial and industrial especially, and underpaying by agriculture for sure, and the bulk of residential. And that's necessary to keep electricity affordable. As we enable these technologies, the risk is that equilibrium of cross subsidies may be in jeopardy. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Economists will say that's a good thing, but politically as well as from a pathway, there are risks to these sorts of things. So utility debt spiral that the US worries about is nothing compared to the underlying equilibriums that are there in India.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question and observation, and certainly the specificity of the Indian experience distinguishes it from what we're facing in the U.S. In the U.S., I actually take the opposite view. I think equilibrium will be achieved with orders like this because it will sort of decentralize the generation, distribution, and consumption of power in the U.S. When you think today, a single EV charging owner can't possibly impact a power market. But if through the power of aggregation, you suddenly have an exponentially greater number of EV power owners putting power back onto the grid, then suddenly you're competing with the power plant down the street, and you're delivering power more effectively where the demand is most precisely needed. And I think that has the power to alter the balance of the way that we do things in the United States. And we actually see opportunity. You mentioned agriculture. One of the staunchest supporters in the U.S. Was a conservative, a leader of the Tea Party movement. For those of you who are familiar with U.S. politics, this is one of the most conservative movements within U.S. politics, focused on limited government. And this leading proponent of the Tea Party from the U.S. state of Georgia, a big agriculture state, cited the trade war with China and the negative impact it was having on farmers in the U.S. and pointed to the opportunities for farmers in the U.S. to deploy solar installations and get into the power business as a way to offset some of the revenue losses they were seeing on the trade side. So we're already seeing innovative American entrepreneurs see opportunity here to get balance and really shift the structural advantages away from incumbent utilities. So certainly the dynamics in India and the equilibrium may be very different. We see different opportunities here in the US and would love, as I did during my time at FERC, sharing my experiences with my counterparts in India, particularly at CERC. In many ways, our experiences in market design, we were able to share with our Indian counterparts so they could learn from what worked for us and what didn't and adapt it to fit the market dynamics within India. And I'm optimistic that once we have a few years of seeing these technologies deployed in the US, similarly, we can share our experiences with our Indian allies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman Chatterjee. I regret that we are well beyond time, and so we'll have to cut short the discussions. But like I requested, maybe ISGF, and I'd be happy to contribute, we can have a moderated roundtable or a more deeper discussion. Because to paraphrase Harry and also several others, what are we asking RE to do? And the regulators to do by extension, because there are so many objectives, whether they're social, fiscal, industrial, outside the energy sector. And so we have to get alignment for all of these objective functions, but also constraints that are there. I will not attempt to summarize.
Yes. I have
Yes.
one very important question to ask Neil, since he's online. We may not have
Very brief, Harry,
very
please.
brief. Neil, did you get an opportunity to pass any regulations on calories to electrons to tariff? Ever?
I did not during my tenure at FERC.
Okay, fair point.
Thank you.
And how would you describe storage finally?
Storage, I think storage is the precursor to what I just laid out in DER. Similar approach, similar construct. DER is a little bit more complicated because of the some of the behind the meter jurisdictional questions in the US, but everything I laid out in terms of DER, that rulemaking, the foundation of that rulemaking was the storage rulemaking.
Okay, so storage is a generating device, consumer or transmission? Where is it going?
That's one of the things we are working through today. Storage is transmission is one of the key questions that is being worked out in some of the compliance filings before FERC from the individual RTOs and ISOs. I am strongly in favor of storage as transmission, but there's not consensus on that issue in the US.
Yeah, because you have this issue in the Electricity Act 2003, which has to be, it has to be defined. But anyway, that's fantastic. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think that is one of the things we will need to evolve.
Mr. Dor, we are back to 2013 when first time when IPPAI did a roundtable on storage where we came to the conclusion that storage should be treated as transmission, although no consensus anywhere, but that's where the things are evolving.
Yep.
I would say that it's all of the above. If there's an ancillary market, if there's a generation demand, it actually plays into everything. So whatever is allowed for others.
Not only that, is also a load. So basically, it
Correct.
covers everything.
Correct.
Yeah,
It should be allowed to play into all markets and frameworks that it impacts or can impact. So with that, I would like to bring this session to a close. But before I do, I'll just attempt to summarize a few key points, not do justice to the rich discussion that was held. The first is, for RE to grow, from a regulatory side, we need to get the signaling right, which is the right signals, pricing, time of day, and so many aspects. RE is no longer a toddler that needs special handholding. It is grown up, and it needs to be treated as that. To make RE work, we'll have to increase smartness of the system. Smart meters is one aspect, but overall grid smartness and nimbleness. We have to, the flip side of that is value other characteristics of a grid, which include reliability and so forth. We have to regulate differently, which is not silo-based. We have to have coupled regulations. We have to have regulations that move away from the centralized monopoly systems. We'll need innovative pricing schemas. Critical peak pricing is just one of them. And we will need some consistency across the objective functions that are there for both renewables, but the larger transformation, which then extends to EVs, hydrogen, and so forth. So we will be writing these up more formally, but these are some of the many insights and recommendations gathered from this distinguished group and their deliberations. Thank you.